My daughter-in-law took me on a hike, smiled sweetly for a selfie, then pushed me off the cliff. 12 hours later, she was on stage declaring me dead and taking over our billion-dollar company. Lying broken on a ledge, I realized I wasn't just betrayed. I was erased, but I survived. And I didn't scream. I watched. I waited. I planned. The day she thought she owned the world was the day I walked back in. And when the lights came on, everything she built came crashing down. But what made her fall wasn't me. I remember the wind. Not the fall, not the scream, not even the way her eyes looked at me just before it happened. No, it was the wind that stayed. Sharp, cold, silent. Like it already knew what she was about to do. We had climbed the ridge just before noon. Raina wore her usual curated smile, flawless makeup, and a Patagonia vest she probably bought for the photo. She insisted on a selfie at the edge of the Flatirons, said it would be good for the company newsletter. I followed, still trying to believe this hike was her way of reaching out. She angled the camera, said lean back just a little. Then she said the words I never thought I'd hear from her. You've served your time. We'll take it from here. Her hands were firm. The push was sudden. I didn't even have time to gasp. I went over. I hit something halfway down, shrubs or branches. Then the world went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in a hospital. I was on a cold ledge, halfway down the ridge, bleeding into dust. My arm was twisted. My lips were cracked. I couldn't move much. But I was alive. For hours I lay there, drifting in and out. The sun passed overhead. The sky dimmed. Coyotes howled far off. And at some point, I heard voices. A man. A woman. Hikers. Their dog found me. I remember the smell of trail mix and the way the woman kept whispering, "Oh my God," as they wrapped my jacket tighter and radioed for help. I told them not to call my family. Not yet. I knew what I had to do. They airlifted me out just before midnight. Broken ribs, concussion, deep bruising. The ranger thought I'd fallen. I let him think that. I asked for one phone call. Not to my son. Not to the police. I called my lawyer in DC. I said one sentence. She tried to kill me. I want the foundation unlocked. Full clause enforcement. Quietly. He didn't ask anything. He just said he understood. That's when I started planning. While my bones healed, my fury didn't. I stayed quiet. Stayed off-grid. I watched from the shadows. And the news kept coming. Less than 12 hours after my fall, Raina held a press conference. She was dressed in navy, hair pinned back, voice calm but somber. She said I had suffered a terrible accident during a hike, that I was presumed dead, that the board had voted to activate the emergency succession protocol, that she would now lead Lattice Forge into a new era. I watched the live stream from a ranger's office in sweatpants and gauze. The applause made my hands shake. Then she did the unthinkable. She brought my son's urn on stage. My son, who died in a car crash just last year. The crowd murmured. She said this company would carry his legacy and honor the family name, that she would never let the Rowan vision die. I almost vomited. That urn didn't belong to her. That legacy wasn't hers to hold. And that company, my company, the one I built from the ground up after years as an engineer with 2 kids and no husband, that company didn't belong to her. But she didn't stop there. The next day, my personal assistant received an email from her legal team. My apartment was being emptied for estate transition. My bank accounts were being audited. And my name was removed from the Lattice Forge founders page, like I had never existed. You want to talk about betrayal? That wasn't just a push off a cliff. That was an erasure. But let me tell you something. You can erase a name from a website. You can strip it off a building. But you cannot erase a woman who built it all with her bare hands, especially when that woman is still breathing. That's when the fire inside me locked in. This wasn't just a power grab. It wasn't just corporate greed. This was personal. Raina had been planning this. The emails, the timing, the media framing, all too perfect. And the foundation I created years ago, the one holding the true voting power of the company, it had a clause. If anyone attempted to seize control of the company through fraudulent, violent, or criminal acts, all rights would be revoked and reverted to the foundation under full legal protection. I had signed that clause in secret. I never thought I'd use it. Now it was the only thing standing between her and total control, and I was going to use it. If you're still listening, stay with me. Because when I walked back into that building 3 weeks later, not in a hospital gown, but in a tailored black suit with the original trust documents in hand, the air changed. But we're not there yet. Next, you'll see exactly how I turned silence into power, how I used every lie they told against them, and how the woman they buried alive came back to bury them all. If you've ever been erased, overlooked, pushed out like you were just part of the past, keep listening. Because this story is for you. I spent the next 3 days in a motel off Highway 36, under a false name, and with a brace wrapped tight around my ribs. The ranger who rescued me thought I had slipped. I didn't correct him. Let them all believe I was a frail old woman who got too close to the edge. That story served me better than the truth, for now. By the time I could walk without needing a wall for support, the world outside had already moved on. Raina was everywhere. Business magazines called her the next face of tech. Investors praised her for taking swift control after my so-called accident. She was all over social media, standing in front of my company's logo, shaking hands, giving interviews about stability and leadership transition. And no one questioned it. Not one soul. My lawyer, Marcus, flew in from DC that Friday. I met him in the back of a hardware store parking lot in Boulder, sitting on a bench with a hat pulled low and sunglasses even though it was dusk. He didn't hug me, didn't even offer a handshake. He opened his briefcase and slid a folder onto the bench between us. "You were right," he said quietly. The power of attorney form filed with the board was forged. The timestamps were scrubbed, but we pulled the server logs. It was submitted 7 hours after the news of your fall. My hands tightened around the bench rail. So they waited just long enough for the world to believe I was dead, then moved. He nodded. There's more. She's not acting alone. Colt's signature appears on several internal memos pushing the emergency transfer. And there's a suspicious transfer of assets the morning after the press conference. Large, quiet, not illegal on the surface, but timed too well. I asked him about Evan. Marcus hesitated, then handed me a USB drive. Financial projections, pitch decks, edited SEC drafts, all traced back to Evan's laptop. They'd inflated quarterly numbers to push a higher IPO valuation. Investors thought they were getting in on solid growth. In reality, half the metrics were dressed-up assumptions. They were going to ride the wave of my death, straight into billions. I stared at the folder, not surprised, just numb. Like the moment after a gun goes off and your ears ring and you don't even flinch. Because somewhere deep down, I had seen it coming. Marcus lit a cigarette and looked straight ahead. "The foundation is secure," he said. "Your clause still holds. If we can prove they committed fraud or violence, your control snaps back automatically. No lawsuit, no waiting. You just need the trigger." I nodded. I already have it. The footage from the hikers had arrived earlier that morning. The woman had emailed it after hearing about the CEO's sudden death on the news. Said she recognized me from the press and thought I should have it. Said her husband had GoPro footage from the climb in case I needed to remember what happened. I remembered. I just needed proof. In the video, you could see it clearly. Raina adjusting the angle, whispering, then stepping aside as I stumbled forward. There was no wind, no slip. Her hand pushed me, firm and deliberate. It was all there. I turned to Marcus. I want to go public, but not yet. I want her to think she's won. I want her so deep into her plan that when I pull the floor out, she doesn't just fall, she implodes. He didn't smile, just nodded and said he'd get the rest in motion. The next day, I flew to DC under the name Lorraine Matthews. It was my mother's name. No one stopped me. I stayed in a townhouse owned by the foundation. Inside was everything I needed: burner phones, clean IDs, old files from the early days of Lattice Forge, and access to the Foundation's legal firewall. From there, I spent the next week assembling my map. I tracked down every signature Raina submitted. I traced every document Colt touched. I downloaded and reviewed every IPO communication Evan had prepped for the board. And in doing so, I found something they had not meant for anyone to see. 3 months before my fall, Raina had submitted a quiet filing to a shell entity registered in Delaware. The entity was tied to a private equity firm overseas. Hidden in the footnotes was a clause granting the firm future voting rights, triggered upon change in executive leadership due to incapacitation. They had already sold their future shares. They bet on my death like it was a stock option. That's when it hit me. My fall wasn't just greed. It wasn't just about the company. It was part of a larger game, a handoff, a consolidation, a quiet, seamless erasure of me from the past, present, and future. And they were going to win. Every headline said it. Every analyst backed it. Every investor believed in her. But they didn't know I was still here. And they sure as hell didn't know what was coming. By the start of the 3rd week, I knew exactly how deep the betrayal ran. Raina hadn't just wanted the company. She wanted legacy, ownership, and absolute control over every piece of it. I could see it in the way she orchestrated everything. Quiet filings, timed media releases, legal positioning so smooth it looked legitimate. To most people, she was the grieving daughter-in-law picking up the torch after a tragic loss. But behind the curtain, it was a takeover, clean, brutal, and surgical. What they didn't count on was that I still had teeth. Marcus and I met every morning at a private workspace in Arlington. He'd bring coffee and updated reports. I'd spend the day making lists, people, documents, patterns. My body still ached from the fall, but pain was easy compared to fury. Fury sharpened you. It gave you purpose. We started with the board. Lattice Forge's board was made up of 9 members. 5 were long-term investors, 2 were newer strategic partners, and 2 were independent advisors. I had personally recruited most of them, but Raina had spent the last year getting close, staging dinners, inserting Evan into key financial briefings, and slowly shifting loyalties. By the time I fell, she had enough informal backing to push through a vote without raising alarms. That explained how she took over so quickly. What didn't make sense, at least not yet, was why no one pushed back. Not one board member questioned the timing. Not one paused the succession protocol. They all signed off like it was inevitable. Until I saw the new term sheets. In the weeks leading up to the IPO announcement, 3 of the 5 investor board members received updated term proposals for future equity options, contingent on continued leadership under Raina's tenure. These weren't small incentives. We were talking about silent promises of post-IPO windfalls if they stayed quiet and let her lead. It wasn't illegal, but it was manipulation, pure and simple. Still, that wasn't enough to bring them down. I needed something bigger, something they couldn't explain away. That's when Marcus mentioned Evan's travel logs. Evan Dryden had been CFO for 3 years. He was good with numbers, bad with limits. A year ago, I caught him trying to roll deferred expenses to polish up quarterly margins. I warned him once. After that, he backed off. But looking at his recent travel history told a different story. He had flown to Zurich twice in the last 4 months. Each trip lined up perfectly with silent corporate structuring tied to a shell firm that eventually connected back to Colt Keating's law group. The pieces weren't just fitting together. They were screaming collusion. We dug deeper. The SEC drafts Evan had submitted included financial growth projections that didn't match internal reports from just weeks before. He'd overwritten line items, smoothed peaks, buried losses into restructuring categories. It looked clean at first glance, but to someone who had built this company from scratch, it was obvious where the dirt had been swept. Marcus brought in a forensic analyst. Within 3 days, we had a full report showing exactly how Evan and Colt inflated projected revenues by 38%, just enough to push a public valuation from 1.5 billion to nearly 2.1, enough to generate massive buzz, enough to justify the insane executive bonuses Raina had quietly drafted for herself and her circle. And while all of this was unfolding behind boardroom doors, Raina was staging her next act. She launched the IPO roadshow with a 3-city media tour: New York, Chicago, San Francisco. She wore dark colors, gave polished, calm speeches, framed herself as a bridge between legacy and innovation, said things like Maeve Rowan taught me everything I know, and I'll never forget the vision she built. The press loved her, investors lined up, Lattice Forge's name trended every time she stepped on stage. And that's exactly what I needed, because while she spoke into microphones, I pulled the wires behind the scenes. One morning, I requested an encrypted trace of Lattice Forge's boardroom security footage. I still had silent authorization access as a founding executive. Marcus found a back door through the vendor portal, and we pulled every minute from the week I died. That's when I saw the vote. The board had gathered in a special session, just hours after my fall. Raina walked in with Colt. Evan followed. She handed out printed copies of the forged power of attorney. She told them this is what Maeve wanted. No one questioned it. They just nodded. Then something caught my eye. On the bottom corner of one document, barely visible, was a timestamp. It was a printing timestamp. It showed that the document had been printed 6 hours after the time Raina claimed I signed it. That was my opening. I now had video of the meeting, the forged document, and a timeline that didn't line up. Still, it wasn't enough. I needed the moment. I needed to bring all of it into the light in a way no one could spin. And that meant waiting. Let her go bigger. Let her get bolder. Let her say just one more sentence into a microphone about how much she honored me. Because when the lights came on, I wanted the whole world watching. I wanted every lie to collapse under its own weight. So I waited. Quiet. Focused. And as I watched her board that plane to San Francisco, smiling and waving, I knew her time was almost up. Because what she didn't know was that I had already filed the trigger clause to the foundation. The clause was simple. If any executive is proven to have obtained authority through coercion, fraud, or harm to the founding party, all rights revert immediately. The clause would go active in less than a week. And when it did, every document she ever signed would vanish beneath her feet. She just didn't know it yet. The day Raina touched down in San Francisco for the final leg of the IPO tour, I sent Marcus the green light. It was time to pull the first thread. We didn't need a headline. Not yet. What we needed was silence. Strategic silence. the kind that makes people nervous enough to start talking without being asked. And the best place to start was internal. Marcus reached out to one of our old allies, a former compliance officer named Jeannie, who had quietly retired after a public disagreement with Evan over restructuring policies. She didn't owe me anything, but she had always respected how I built the company. After a few calls and some secure messaging, she agreed to meet off the record. What she gave us changed everything. Jeannie had copies of the early drafts of the internal audits from the previous fiscal year. The versions she submitted before Evan's team stepped in and streamlined them. In her versions, operational expenses were up 12%, employee churn was flagged as abnormal, and 2 key vendor accounts were marked as high risk due to inconsistent fulfillment. All of that had been scrubbed. The official versions filed with the board showed smooth numbers, balanced costs, and clean vendor reports. The edits weren't just optimistic, they were coordinated. And the metadata confirmed the edits came from Evan's credentials, but through Colt's firm's server. They were laundering financials through legal review to avoid leaving direct fingerprints. We added it to the file. That afternoon, Marcus submitted a sealed report to the SEC through the Foundation's whistleblower provision, not as a formal charge, but as a signal, enough to trigger quiet scrutiny, enough to stall momentum from the inside without alerting Raina too early. By evening, the first sign landed. One of the early institutional investors issued a statement delaying their decision to participate in the IPO. They cited standard due diligence and a need for updated financial review. It was a small ripple, but ripples grow. That night, I watched Raina speak at a private investor dinner. Her smile looked tighter, her voice carried the same polish, but her pacing changed. She rushed her closer, her confidence thinned. I knew she felt it. The air shifting. 2 days later, we got what we were waiting for. A red envelope, hand-delivered to the Foundation's legal team. Inside was a subpoena. The SEC had initiated a quiet inquiry. Not public, not disruptive, but real. They wanted access to Lattice Forge's internal audit logs, executive authorizations, and IPO-related financials. Effective immediately. That was the first domino. But I still needed one more thing before we went public. Proof of motive. Because manipulation and fraud made for great headlines. But what made people fall apart was betrayal, especially when it was personal. I went back to the beginning, to my son. 2 weeks before he died in that crash, he had sent me a voicemail I hadn't been able to listen to until now. It was short, just a few seconds. He had been driving, said he needed to talk, said something wasn't sitting right with him. Then the line went dead. I had always thought it was a bad signal, but now I listened again, not with grief, with purpose. His voice cracked slightly when he said he felt boxed in, like decisions were being made behind his back. He mentioned Raina, said she was pushing for something and he didn't trust the timing. Marcus ran a background request on the driver of the truck that hit him. The report came back clean. No criminal history, no connection on paper. But then we pulled phone records. 5 days before the accident, Colt called a number registered to a real estate development firm in Texas. That same number showed up twice on the truck driver's call log the night before the crash. It wasn't solid proof, but it was a link. Enough for me to believe the crash wasn't random, and enough to push me forward. I asked Marcus to prepare a sequence of disclosures. First, a document release showing financial manipulation and timeline inconsistencies. Second, a pre-recorded video from me, verifying that I was alive and in full mental capacity. Third, a formal invocation of the Foundation clause that would revoke all executive powers granted under fraudulent or coercive circumstances. But we weren't going to drop them all at once. We would let her step onto the biggest stage of her life, let her speak to investors, claim her crown, lift the curtain on a new era, and then we would rip the stage out from under her. Marcus sent the first batch of documents anonymously to 3 independent journalists known for tech investigative work. Within 12 hours, they were already calling sources inside the company. The rumors began to spread. Whispers of inconsistencies. Talks of a hidden founder still alive. Raina's team issued a statement calling the chatter baseless, said everything was in full compliance. That was the final cue. I reached out to my media contact in Denver and asked for one favor: a seat at the private rehearsal for the IPO's final investor showcase. Not on the list. No name badge, just a corner seat in the back row. He arranged it. And 2 days later, I flew back to Colorado. This time not as a founder, not as a victim, but as a witness. The room was grand, stage lights, crisp banners, branded podium. Evan stood near the edge, reviewing slides. Colt whispered into his phone, pacing. Raina stood in the center, running her notes, pausing to adjust her blazer. She looked calm, collected, but I knew better. I sat in the dark, watching, quiet, unseen, and I waited for her to say the words, the ones that would tip the scale, and give me the moment I needed to end it all. I sat in the shadows, hidden behind a column draped with a lattice forge banner, watching the people who thought they had buried me. The final investor showcase rehearsal had just begun, but to them, it might as well have been opening night. Lights perfect, script perfect, everything carefully staged for the biggest show of Raina's life. I had planned it that way. Raina took the stage with steady heels, a charcoal pantsuit that screamed authority, and a carefully softened voice. She welcomed the room, spoke of vision, transition, and strength in leadership. She talked about loss, how tragedy shaped growth, and then, with a smile like steel beneath silk, she looked out into the crowd and said that everything she had done had been in honor of my legacy. She called me a mentor, a builder, a woman she respected. That was the line I needed, the exact sentence we planned for, because now we could prove her hypocrisy in front of every shareholder and regulatory body on record. Back at the townhouse, Marcus was already standing by with a scheduled drop. The digital timer synced with her presentation timeline. As soon as she said those words, the release went live. At 10:43 a.m., 3 files hit every inbox on the internal Lattice Forge executive distribution list, key SEC liaisons, and all 5 major media outlets covering the IPO. The first file showed the video from the boardroom, Raina presenting the forged power of attorney to the board, the one with the mismatched timestamp and altered metadata. The second file was a breakdown of the fabricated audit trail linked directly to Evan's login credentials, with forensic timestamps highlighting every discrepancy. And the third file, the one I knew would burn everything to the ground, was a simple PDF. A scanned image of the Foundation's clause, the one I had signed 7 years ago. It included the emergency override section in full, highlighted, stamped, and filed with the Department of Corporate Governance, still valid, still binding. That clause, active now, stripped Raina of all legal authority. Her power, on paper, in contracts, in voting rights, was gone the moment she opened her mouth and spoke in my name under false pretenses. She just didn't know it yet. But the room did. The first alerts hit phones by 10:45. I watched it unfold in real time. One investor glanced down, eyebrows raising. A staff member near the exit pulled out their phone, then slowly stood up and walked out. The head of investor relations began whispering urgently to someone near the AV booth. Evan saw it too. He moved toward the edge of the stage, leaning over to whisper something to Raina, but she held up a hand. She didn't like being interrupted. Colt was the first to panic. His face drained the moment he opened his tablet. He froze, then turned and left the room without saying a word. Gone, before the walls collapsed. At 10:48, a buzz rolled through the room like a low earthquake. I stepped out from the shadows. No announcement, no warning, no dramatic entrance. I simply walked down the left aisle, steady and slow. Some people gasped, others stared, confused, unsure if I was real. But Raina saw me, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Her lips parted, her breath caught. Her hand went slightly rigid at her side. She didn't move. She didn't speak. I stopped at the center of the aisle. "This is not your company," I said. "This never was." Then I turned to the audience. "I'm Maeve Rowan, founder, alive, and I never gave her permission." No one clapped, no one spoke. The silence was loud enough to swallow the whole room. Behind me, the main screen flickered. Marcus had gained access through our old admin protocols. He flashed a slide with the foundation document, the legal seals, the timestamp of activation. Then, the GoPro footage. The room watched as Raina smiled into the camera, positioned it for the perfect selfie, and stepped aside while I fell out of frame. No commentary, no music. Just the raw sound of wind and the dull thud of silence after I vanished. By 11:02, the event was officially cancelled. Security escorted Evan out the side door. Raina didn't follow. She just stood there, shaking slightly, her eyes still fixed on the screen. I walked past her. Didn't stop. She didn't reach out. Didn't speak. She looked like a statue, carved from ambition and failure, already starting to crack. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. Reporters had started gathering. I didn't stop for them. I had said what needed saying. Now the machines would take over. Legal filings, shareholder memos, internal transitions. The foundation, by law, would resume control. A new interim board would be appointed. The IPO would be paused pending SEC review. Evan would be questioned. Colt would be subpoenaed. And Raina, she would be stripped of everything. She had bet on my death, had planned her rise on the back of a coffin she thought she had nailed shut. But the coffin opened, and the woman inside came back, not to scream or cry or beg, but to take back what was hers. I didn't need revenge served hot or cold. I needed it clean. And now it was done. She had stood on that stage to announce her reign. But in truth, it was the stage where everything she built unraveled in front of a room full of witnesses. And the world would remember that moment, not as the beginning of her power, but the hour it died. The day after the rehearsal collapse, silence swept through Lattice Forge like a power outage. No memos, no press releases, no emails beyond legal boilerplate and cancellation notices. Inside the building, employees sat at their desks pretending to work while their screens buzzed with private chats and quiet speculation. The woman they thought was dead had walked back in. The CEO they thought would lead them into a public offering had been exposed on camera, mid-lie, mid-fall. No one knew what came next, but everyone knew things were broken. I didn't return to the office. That wasn't my role anymore. My presence had already served its purpose. I had flipped the spotlight and let the facts speak louder than any accusation. What came next needed a different kind of power, procedural, legal, permanent. Marcus and I moved fast. That morning he filed a formal revocation of all executive privileges for Raina, Evan and Colt under the Foundation Clause. With that filing, the board was immediately dissolved. pending reappointment by the Foundation's Oversight Committee. Within hours, corporate control passed to a trustee team with no prior ties to internal leadership. Raina was stripped of her CEO title. Evans' system access was revoked. Colt's law firm received notifications of an impending ethics review, and every account tied to their compensation packages was frozen. At 10:35 a.m., the SEC confirmed the formal suspension of Lattice Forge's IPO. By noon, the news hit every major outlet. Investor confidence collapsed like a faulty bridge, stock option deals went dead, conference calls were cancelled before they began. And at the center of it all was one single truth, undeniable and unspinnable. The founder was alive, and everything that followed her disappearance had been built on lies. I spent that afternoon watching it unfold on the news in complete stillness. My hands folded, my jaw tight. Not in anger, not in pride, but in the strange calm that comes after a storm tears through and leaves behind nothing but dust and exposed roots. That evening, Marcus called with an update. The DOJ had picked up the SEC's referral. They were officially opening an investigation into securities fraud, conspiracy, and attempted manipulation of a federally regulated financial event. The charges would take time to build. But the Foundation's private investigators had already forwarded them a compiled file, including every falsified financial statement, every misrepresented investor term sheet, and the full video footage from the rehearsal. Evan was served with a notice of inquiry the next morning. Colt was flagged attempting to board a flight out of the country with an unregistered device and was detained under suspicion of document destruction. And Raina, she stayed silent. She hadn't made a statement, not even a single sentence. Her legal team issued something short and vague, a generic line about transitional chaos and respect for ongoing review. But she herself disappeared from public view. Until I saw her name on my visitor log. The townhouse where I had been staying had a gate and a front desk. Marcus had arranged for it through the Foundation. That morning, the security staff sent me a message. A woman named Raina Keating had arrived, unannounced, asking to speak to me in person. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen, unsure what I would even say if I saw her. Part of me didn't want to see her at all. But another part, the part of me that had stood alone after my son's funeral, the part that had laid bruised on a cliff and listened to her voice echo in my ears, knew I had to. So I told them to let her in. No cameras, no staff, just her and me in the sitting room. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. The polish was gone. Her eyes were puffy, and the confidence that once lit up her face had been replaced with something harder to name. Not guilt, not regret. More like fatigue, the kind that sinks into your bones after everything you counted on starts to rot. She didn't sit down. She looked at me like I was something ancient, something heavy. Then, finally, she spoke. "I didn't think you'd survive." The words hung in the air, brittle and cold. I waited. She went on, slower this time. I thought maybe if it ended quickly, cleanly, no one would question it. You were tired. You were already scaling back. I just accelerated the inevitable. My fingers curled around the armrest. Not from rage, but restraint. "He was your husband," I said. "You planned it before he even died." She flinched. "He didn't know," she whispered. "He never would have agreed. That's why I had to move when I did. He wouldn't have let me." And there it was. She had orchestrated the entire thing because she knew he wouldn't support her, because she knew he still believed in me. "You buried him for convenience," I said, "and tried to bury me for profit." She said nothing. I waited for her to justify, to deny, to weep. She didn't. Instead, she finally sat down and folded her hands. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I told her plainly. "The Foundation owns everything again. The investigation will proceed. Your assets are frozen. You'll be indicted. You'll be tried. The company will survive, but not under your name. And if the law finds you guilty, you'll serve the time." She nodded slowly, as if she had already known it all. "I only wanted to be seen," she said. "I spent years working in your shadow." I leaned forward. "You weren't in my shadow. You walked beside me until you chose a knife over loyalty." For a moment, her lips trembled. But she didn't cry, and I didn't comfort her, because healing didn't mean softening, not for people like her. When she stood to leave, she looked at me one last time. "I wish you had stayed dead," she said. I stared right back. "I'm sure you do." She walked out without turning back, and I sat there in silence, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore. Just clears the air, just leaves the ground open for something new. By the end of the week, the aftermath had shifted from whispers to impact. Venture partners who once fought over placement in our IPO quietly disappeared. Media outlets rewrote their narratives, replacing glossy features about Raina's leadership with cautious timelines detailing the collapse. Government agencies continued their inquiries with quiet efficiency. And internally, Lattice Forge was beginning to take on a shape I almost didn't recognize. Wounded, uncertain, but still standing. My return hadn't brought applause. It had brought accountability. And that was exactly what I intended. But revenge, as complete as it seemed, was never the real goal. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was to protect what I built. And to do that, I needed to do something I had avoided for far too long. I needed to return to the boardroom, not to reclaim power, but to rebuild the future. That Monday morning, I walked through the doors of the Lattice Forge headquarters for the first time in nearly 2 years. The security staff nodded quietly. No badge, no scan, just recognition. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. Laughter no longer echoed from corner lounges. The bright startup buzz had dimmed into something more cautious. Yet the people still moved, still worked, still believed in the bones of the place. I met Marcus on the executive floor. He handed me the finalized list for the interim board appointments. We had selected professionals with no ties to the previous scandal, experts in governance, ethics, and risk. No one flashy, no one political, just competence and integrity. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. When I entered the boardroom, the remaining staff who had not been removed were already seated. Some looked at me with relief, others with unease, and I understood why. I was a reminder of everything that had come undone. I took my seat at the head of the table. Not because I wanted it, but because this was the last time I would ever sit there. I opened the meeting by acknowledging what had happened, not just the attempted takeover, but the culture that allowed it to grow. The silence, the overlooked red flags, the way fear and ambition had been normalized. I didn't speak long. Then I stood and handed the legal authority of the company over to the interim board. No applause, no ceremony, just a simple moment of transfer. Marcus stepped forward to explain the path forward. Internal audits, transparent communications, a restructured board election, and above all, a delay of the IPO until the company could prove to regulators and the public that its governance was sound. The meeting closed without discussion. That afternoon, I walked through the labs and engineering floors, shaking hands with the teams who still showed up every day despite the chaos. Some had joined after I left and only knew me by name. Others had been there since we were operating out of a garage in Denver. Every conversation was quiet, measured. No one asked about the drama. No one mentioned Raina. What mattered was tomorrow. Later that evening, I found myself standing outside my old office. The door was closed. Inside, nothing had changed. The desk was still mine. The photos of my children, the worn leather chair, the old mug with the faded company logo. I stepped inside for just a moment, and then I picked up the mug and left the rest behind. I didn't need that space anymore. That night, Marcus updated me on the legal proceedings. Colt had been released pending investigation, but placed under restriction. Evan's financial records had been frozen and were now under forensic review. And Raina's legal counsel had entered negotiations, likely preparing for a deal that would reduce sentencing in exchange for cooperation. They would face their consequences, but that was no longer mine to enforce. The next morning, I sat down with a journalist from one of the few outlets I still respected. No cameras, no bright lights, just a recorder and 2 mugs of black coffee. I didn't tell her everything, not the fall, not the whispers, but I told her the heart of it. How legacy is not something you demand, it's something you defend. How silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the space where power waits. And how sometimes the only way to protect what you've built is to burn down the illusions others built on top of it. She asked what I planned to do now. I told her the truth. I was done. Not bitter, not broken, just ready to live outside the corridors of strategy and control, ready to breathe again. The article was published 2 days later under the headline, "The Founder Who Chose Fire Over Applause." I didn't read the comments. Instead, I spent that week packing what little remained at the townhouse. I left behind folders and strategy decks. Took only what mattered. A photograph of my son, a copy of the foundation charter, and the mug from my office, now chipped at the handle. On my final day in the city, I stood outside the building one last time, watched the employees shuffle in, heads high. The weight had lifted. A new beginning was forming. Then I turned and walked away. Not out of grief, not out of vengeance, but because the work, at last, was done. And what came next didn't need me in the boardroom, it needed me free. By the time April rolled in, the weight of what happened had settled into something heavier than anger. There were no more headlines, no more breaking news, just the slow and necessary process of dismantling what had been broken and figuring out what would replace it. The DOJ formally opened proceedings against Colt and Evan during the second week of the month. Charges ranged from wire fraud to securities manipulation, with enough documentation to keep their attorneys busy for years. Neither man gave a statement. They moved behind lawyers and affidavits now, trading the spotlight for courtrooms and silence. Evan, in particular, had gone quiet. From what Marcus told me, he had attempted to negotiate a reduced charge in exchange for access to encrypted financial files that might implicate Raina further. The government didn't accept. They already had enough. Colt had taken a different path. He tried to distance himself from it all, arguing that he was merely following client instructions, that he didn't know about the forged documents, that he had no part in the financial manipulation. But the audit logs said otherwise. His electronic signature was on everything that mattered, including the backdated shell company agreements and the false legal reviews. The house of cards had collapsed. There was no wind strong enough to lift it again. Meanwhile, Raina's attorneys filed their response. No contest on several points, and a quiet indication that she was preparing for plea negotiations. She hadn't been charged yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The footage, the forged papers, the foundation clause, the recorded boardroom meeting. She could stall, but she couldn't erase what had been made public. And yet, through all of it, I didn't feel vindicated. There was no satisfaction in watching people squirm, only a dull ache, the kind that comes after holding your breath for too long. I wasn't here to win. I was here to stop something from poisoning the roots of what I built. Still, justice mattered, and that meant seeing it all the way through. I met with the new interim board for the final time that month. The structure was in place. The voting protocols had been updated. Whistleblower systems reworked. Ethical oversight committees reinstated and strengthened. It wasn't perfect, but it was ready to stand on its own. I made it clear I would not be returning in any formal capacity. I didn't want a title. I didn't need a chair at the table. My time in that space had ended. What mattered now was what they did next, and what I did next. Because in the middle of all the public fallout, another door had quietly opened. The university where I first studied engineering, where I had taken night classes while working double shifts, had reached out. They wanted to start a new initiative focused on ethical AI development. Not just another lab, a long-term investment in doing things right. And they wanted me to help design it. No boardrooms, no shareholders, just students, ideas, real impact. I said yes, not for publicity, not for legacy, but because it felt like a return to something cleaner. I began sketching the program outline late into the evenings, a 3-year track, focused on equity, accessibility, and the intersection of data and ethics. I made calls, gathered advisors, pulled names from my past that had stayed true, even when things got ugly. And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was quiet, but it was steady. Outside the courtroom drama, there was still life moving forward. My granddaughter visited during spring break. She didn't ask about Raina or the company. She just wanted pancakes and to play cards. And that was enough. Marcus called near the end of the month. His voice was calm but firm. He told me the federal case against Raina had been officially opened. There was a chance she might avoid jail time, but the financial penalties would be severe. She would never work in corporate finance again. Her name would never sit on a leadership document again. Her public record would carry the stain of what she did. I thanked him, then asked him not to call me again unless it was urgent. I didn't need daily updates anymore. The fire had burned out, and in its place was something quieter. Not peace exactly, but a clearing. I began walking each morning, nothing dramatic, just a mile or two around the lake near the townhouse. I passed the same people most days, a retired couple, a man with a golden retriever, a teenage girl who always had earbuds in and never looked up. None of them knew me, and that felt like a gift. I wasn't the founder walking into her company to reclaim power. I wasn't the woman falling from a cliff with betrayal still ringing in her ears. I was just another person moving forward. One morning I paused near a bench facing the water. The trees had started to bloom again. The world didn't care about broken contracts or lawsuits. It just kept turning. That was when I realized the story was ending. Not just for them, but for me. Not in bitterness, not in pride, but in release. Whatever they faced next, Raina, Colt, Evan, it would be theirs alone. The courts, the agencies, the headlines. I had stepped off that path. Now I was building something new, quietly, deliberately, with clean hands and clear breath. I looked at the water and said nothing. And that silence, for the first time in a long time, felt like mine. The morning after the court hearing, the air in my apartment felt still. Not quiet, not peaceful, just still. like the house was holding its breath with me. I sat at the table with the same cup of black coffee I'd been nursing for hours, my fingers resting on the edge of the mug, barely noticing the warmth. I wasn't waiting for news. I already knew what was coming. But I was steady now, steady like stone. It was time to end this the right way. The hearing yesterday had cracked open something deeper. The judge had ordered a temporary hold on the eviction request, giving my legal team time to submit further evidence regarding Mia's abandonment and her lack of any contact for over 20 years. The public nature of it meant the media picked it up, especially once someone caught wind of the ranch's value and its IPO connection. By nightfall, I was the face of resilience in some online circles, while others turned Mia into a cautionary tale. That was never my goal, but I wasn't about to stop it either. I called Reese. He answered in one ring. "She's coming to the ranch today." I said it flatly. Not to argue, not to beg, just facts. He hesitated, then said he'd be there too. Around noon, I pulled up to the ranch. The wind rolled low across the fields. I walked past the stables, past the equipment shed, and stopped by the old bench where I used to rock David when he was just a baby. Funny how those things come back to you in moments like this. Places don't change as much as people do. When I turned around, Mia was standing near the porch. Her designer shoes were digging into the gravel, her tailored blazer looking painfully out of place against the dust and faded paint. There was no camera crew, no lawyers, just her. She thought she had the upper hand now that the judge hadn't thrown out her case immediately, but she didn't realize the kind of storm I'd prepared for. "You look tired," she said. Her voice was cool, but there was a tremble at the edge of it. "I'm not tired. I've just been awake for 20 years. I motioned toward the bench, and we both sat, separated by 3 feet and a world of damage. "I want my son back," she started. "You gave up that right when he was 3 days old. That was then. He's mine. I gave birth to him, and I raised him, through every fever, every school form, every heartbreak, every scraped knee. He's not a prize to reclaim when convenient." She looked down at her hands, then up at the horizon like it held something she needed. "You wouldn't understand what I went through." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My silence filled the space where excuses used to hide. "He deserves to know his real mother," she tried again. "He already does. He calls her grandma." That landed. She flinched like I'd struck her, but she didn't leave. I didn't expect her to. That ranch belongs to him. That company too. I can make sure it's handled properly. He's too young to manage all that. He's 21. And unlike you, he's stayed grounded. He knows what it means to earn something instead of waiting for it to be handed back." She shifted in her seat, frustrated. The pity card wasn't working. The guilt card had expired. "I've filed for guardianship again," she said. "And this time I have medical documentation to support my claim. You're not in the best shape. You're not getting younger." So that was the angle. Play the age card. Claim I was unfit. I had expected it. I stood. I walked to the steps, then turned to face her. I kept my voice even. "You've forgotten something. While you were out chasing your next life, I was here documenting this one. Every expense, every record, every missed birthday, every letter you never wrote. Every Christmas morning he sat by the window hoping you'd show up. You abandoned him. And I protected him from knowing the full truth. Because I thought someday, if you came back, maybe you'd at least try to be decent." Her eyes darted. She realized I wasn't bluffing. I had it all. "There's more to," I said. "I've submitted everything to the court, including testimony from your parents, your sister, even the neighbor who saw you get in that taxi 21 years ago with nothing but your purse." She went pale. And just so we're clear, I continued, I also forwarded a file to the IRS. You see, I had to pay for David's care myself. I kept all those tax records. But it seems you filed as a single parent last year, listing him as a dependent. That's federal fraud. The court may delay justice, but the IRS doesn't. She stood up fast. I thought she might scream, might throw something. But all she did was stand there, breath caught, eyes locked on mine. You think this is over? She whispered. It is. For you. I turned my back and walked toward the barn. Behind me, her footsteps didn't follow. That evening, Reese came by. He didn't say much, just stood with me by the fence. We watched the horses in the pasture, heads low as they grazed. You sure you're okay going through with it? He asked after a while. It has to be done. She thought this was about property, but it was always about respect, about consequences. He nodded. Then he told me something that made the final nail sink in. Mia had tried to reach out to David directly again, this time through a fake social media account, posing as someone else, trying to manipulate him into agreeing to sign something behind my back. But David had already figured it out and sent the entire exchange to my lawyer. She was unraveling. And the worst part was, she didn't even know it. That night, I made my final statement for the court. It wasn't dramatic, just truthful. I asked not for punishment, but for clarity. For the record to reflect the reality of 21 years. For David's rights to remain protected. For the ranch to stay in the hands of someone who had lived every inch of it. And I sent a private email to Mia with one sentence. You lost him the day you left him. I didn't expect a reply. None came. But I felt something lift off me as I clicked send. Not victory, not triumph, just release. The kind that comes after a storm has passed and you finally step outside to breathe again. I sat in the back of the courtroom, silent, still, hands folded in my lap as if I were praying. But no prayers came to mind. My thoughts weren't with heaven. They were grounded, anchored in years of scars and every word Everly had spat into that microphone. Her voice carried arrogance, not love, not regret, just entitlement. The judge had taken a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied into low murmurs and hallway pacing. I didn't move. I was still absorbing the blow of Everly's testimony. She claimed I'd manipulated her, that I'd forged Brett's deathbed wishes, that I used the ranch and IPO wealth to isolate her daughter. The lies were layered with just enough truth to sting. It was masterful. I knew she'd studied me for years. She knew exactly how to weaponize my past against me. What Everly didn't expect, though, was that I wasn't going to sit and play noble anymore. That mask she painted on me, the sweet old woman who once made soup and stitched curtains, no longer existed. That woman died the day Everly buried her son and then vanished with no goodbye. Brett's private journals were with my lawyer. So were emails, bank records. A notarized letter from him dated 6 months before his accident, outlining guardianship. Not a single word had Everly's name. All of it handed over to the court weeks ago, silently waiting. But what came next was not about documents. The bailiff called everyone back in, and the judge returned. This time, there was a subtle shift. My attorney stood with a new binder, thick with transcripts, highlighted annotations, and sealed reports. It began with the story of the trust. Not the public one, the real one. The one Brett and I created together, meant to fund education initiatives for working-class girls from small towns. A legacy project, something to give meaning to his pain. The trust bore my name, but the engine behind it was Brett's story. He had chosen to build it quietly, fund it with his own money from his earlier business ventures, long before the IPO ever launched. Everly had tried to include the trust in her lawsuit, claimed it was a shell account I used to hide assets from her daughter. But the financial records told another story. Every dollar was traceable, every transfer clean. And then came the twist. Two of the board members overseeing the trust were called as witnesses. One was a former executive from Brett's first startup. The other, an estate attorney who had met with Brett and me 4 separate times before his accident. They both spoke, calm and deliberate, about Brett's intent. That the trust was meant to be sealed until his daughter turned 25. That he did not want Everly to have access, direct or indirect. That Brett feared Everly would manipulate their daughter for money if given the chance. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Everly's attorney objected. But it didn't matter. The judge allowed it. The sealed documents were authenticated. My attorney walked through every detail with methodical precision, letting the truth speak for itself. Then came the kicker, a voice recording. It was Brett. Grainy audio from his hospital bed. Time stamped, verified. He spoke slowly, clearly. He thanked me. Said he knew Everly would never understand the weight he carried. Said he was sorry for leaving me with the pieces. Said he trusted me more than anyone on earth to raise their daughter with values that would keep her grounded. I closed my eyes. For a second, the courtroom faded. It was just Brett's voice and mine. A moment I hadn't expected to share, let alone weaponize. But I let it happen. I let the room hear it. Because I was done protecting the image of a woman who had done nothing but destroy mine. Everly didn't look at me when the audio stopped. She stared at the floor, her jaw clenched. Her attorney called for a break, but the judge refused. The show would go on. Next came the PI's findings. My lawyer laid them out cleanly. The accounts Everly had opened under false business names, the real estate purchased through proxies, the assets held offshore. Everly wasn't broke. She wasn't desperate. She had simply wanted more. Wanted what her husband built, what I protected, and what her daughter didn't yet even understand. By the time the judge recessed for the day, the tone of the courtroom had shifted. Reporters were scribbling with urgency. Even Everly's expression changed. It was no longer cold calculation. It was something closer to panic, like she had misjudged the depth of what I held in reserve. I walked past her without a word. I could feel her watching me as I passed. I didn't flinch. When I reached the parking lot, the mountain air hit hard, cold and crisp. My breath came out in steam. I leaned against the car for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I heard a voice. It was Everly's daughter, my granddaughter. She wasn't scheduled to testify until the next day, but she had come early. She walked over, tentative. She stood next to me, but didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she heard the recording. She said she hadn't known her father left something like that behind, that he trusted me like that. Her voice cracked when she said it. I told her I never wanted this war, that I had protected her not just out of duty, but out of love, that I was tired, that all I had wanted was for her to stand on her own one day and not be owned by anyone, not even her mother. She nodded. I could see the conflict in her, the pull of bloodlines and loyalty and pain. But I saw something else too. She didn't follow her mother back inside. She stood with me, quiet, still. And I realized in that moment I didn't need a victory. I had already won something greater. The morning after the final confrontation, the house was unnervingly quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the heavy sort that follows a storm. I stood by the window in the dining room, watching the early sun stretch across the land, casting long shadows on the gravel path that had seen too many arguments and too many lies. My body felt lighter, but inside, everything churned. I wasn't celebrating, I was breathing, just breathing. After the judge's ruling, Evan hadn't come near me. He didn't call. He didn't apologize. He didn't even ask to speak to the grandson he once used as a pawn. That silence said more than any words ever could. There was no redemption in his eyes during that final moment in court. Only shock, and maybe a flicker of rage that I had outsmarted him. But he had no ground left to stand on, and I think he finally knew it. I made my way into the kitchen, the same place where he once told me I was just the temporary guardian, where he told me I was nothing more than a babysitter while he and Chelsea figured things out. I opened the cupboard, reached for my old ceramic mug with the chip on the handle, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The bitterness grounded me. Grant walked in a few minutes later. He looked tired but less burdened. He sat across from me, poured his own coffee, and didn't speak right away. We had grown to understand each other in silence, especially these past few days. After everything he'd heard, everything he'd read in the sealed letters and legal papers I gave the court, he no longer saw me as just the woman who raised him. He saw the truth of what I had protected him from, and that changed something in our bond. He finally spoke. I nodded, letting the weight of his words sit between us. There was no need to dissect them. He understood now. He saw clearly the years I spent stitching his life back together after Chelsea and Evan tore it apart. After breakfast, I sat down with Miriam, my lawyer, at the big oak table in the study. The light fell through the window just right, glinting off the stack of folders in front of her. The legal ownership of the ranch had been sealed, and the trust would remain in Grant's name until he turned 30. I was reinstated as sole conservator until then. No more threats, no more claims. The court had made it final. But that wasn't what we were there to discuss. There was one more thing left undone, something I had been preparing for silently, carefully. I told her I wanted to move forward with the restraining order, not just against Evan, but also Chelsea. The attempt to manipulate, threaten, and emotionally blackmail both Grant and me had crossed every line. Miriam agreed without hesitation. It wasn't vengeance, it was protection. It was me drawing the final boundary. That afternoon I visited the barn. The horses seemed restless, maybe picking up on the emotional residue still hanging in the air. I walked slowly along the wooden stalls, running my hand over the worn boards. The scent of hay and dust felt grounding. This ranch had endured storms before, both literal and human. It had survived droughts, blizzards, and even betrayal. And now it was mine again. No more signatures to fight over, no more forged documents, just mine. And Grant's. He joined me in the barn not long after, and together we brushed down Thunder, his old grey mare. She nuzzled his shoulder like she remembered him as a boy. We didn't talk much, just worked side by side like we used to. He didn't need answers anymore. He had them all. What he needed now was steadiness, and I could finally give him that. That evening, I sat out on the porch, the sun low and soft. A breeze rolled across the fields, rustling the tall grass like whispers of peace. I could see the edge of the western hills, glowing faintly in the dusk. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't watching my back or second-guessing every decision. I had done what needed to be done. I had stood my ground. Grant came out with 2 glasses of lemonade. We sat in silence for a while, watching the horizon shift from gold to blue. He asked me if I ever regretted not telling him sooner. I told him I used to, but not anymore. Back then, protecting him meant keeping him innocent. Now, protecting him meant trusting him with the truth. He nodded slowly. That was enough for him. We talked a little about the future, not in grand plans or sweeping statements, but in small, grounded ideas. Fixing up the southern fence, expanding the cattle pasture, maybe reopening the bed and breakfast cabins we shut down during the worst years. He offered to help, said he wanted to be more involved. I smiled but didn't make promises. We would take it one day at a time, and that was okay. Before bed, I stood in front of the mirror in my room, the same mirror where I once looked at myself and saw a tired woman holding on by a thread. Tonight, I saw someone else. Someone older, yes. Someone weathered, without question, but someone whole. I didn't need to win anyone's approval. I didn't need to be forgiven. I had walked through fire and come out with my dignity intact. I climbed into bed, the covers soft and familiar. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle around me like a blanket. The quiet this time wasn't heavy. It was restful. I slept without dreams. Just breath. Just peace. And I knew, deep in my bones, that I had finally come home to myself. The court's final gavel felt like a soft thud compared to the years of emotional wreckage that had preceded it. The judge's ruling was clear and public. Ivy had not only lost custody, but was barred from contacting Nolan unless he chose otherwise after his 18th birthday. The court cited psychological manipulation, financial deceit, and a reckless disregard for the emotional development of the child she had abandoned. But I did not gloat. I stepped out of the courthouse alone. No press, no lawyers lingering, just me. A late spring breeze danced across the steps, and for the first time in years, I could breathe without gripping the railing for support. Back at home, Nolan was already waiting. He had watched the live stream with my friend Suzanne. When I walked through the door, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, then walked forward and wrapped his arms around me. His voice, quiet and steady, carried the only words I needed. I know who my real family is. That night we sat on the porch together, no legal documents between us. Just hot tea, a sky full of stars, and the gentle hum of crickets. I didn't speak of Ivy. I didn't need to. Nolan brought out his sketchbook and showed me the plans for the therapy dog training center he wanted to build on the east acre of the property. He had already started saving. That was when I knew he was going to be all right. The weeks that followed were quiet. No phone calls, no more lawyers, no reporters. Ivy disappeared from the media after her employer cut ties. Her tech startup pulled her bio and quietly removed her from the leadership team. The world moved on, and so did we. But moving on didn't mean forgetting. Some wounds stay even when they heal. They become part of your skin, not visible to everyone, but you feel them when the wind hits just right. One afternoon, I got a letter. It was from Ivy. No return address, just a plain envelope tucked into the mailbox by hand. She wrote about regret, about watching Nolan grow up from the sidelines through photos on social media, through what her private investigator had gathered. She said she had made the worst mistake of her life by leaving, then a worse one by returning for money. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for contact. She just wrote that she would be leaving the country, starting over, and that she hoped one day Nolan might understand. I folded the letter and placed it in the cedar box where I kept pieces of our life, not to erase her, but to remind myself what survival looked like. I kept my promise to Nolan. He got into Colorado State with a full scholarship in animal science. The Flatirons Ranch remained under my name, but the trust for him was locked and secured for when he graduated. He still came home on weekends, sometimes with muddy boots, and sometimes with friends who called me Ma like they had known me their whole lives. There was laughter again. Honest, unforced, room-filling laughter. Sometimes at night, I would sit by the window with an old cup of tea and think about all the nights I cried alone in the same spot. How different silence felt now. Then it was loneliness. Now it was peace. I took down the framed photo that had hung by the staircase for years. It was a family portrait from before all the chaos. I replaced it with a photo Nolan had taken last summer. Just the two of us and the dogs, standing in the golden light of late July, smiling without tension. One day I walked into the local store and saw my face on a flyer. Not for court, not for scandal, but for a volunteer recognition dinner. Apparently, the youth program Nolan and I had helped sponsor had grown enough to be noticed. I smiled and tucked the flyer into my bag. It wasn't fame, but it was something better. It was the life I built after everyone tried to tear it down. It was my proof that healing isn't loud. It's not fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it's quiet mornings, a loaf of fresh bread, a dog resting its head on your lap, a child who no longer carries your pain on their shoulders. I never needed revenge. I only needed peace. And I had found it. Not in the courtroom, not in the money, but in the quiet certainty that I had done the right thing, and in the soft sound of Nolan's voice when he came home late and whispered, "Thanks for never giving up on me." That was all the closure I ever needed. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone's quiet strength, let us know in the comments. Would you have fought the same way if you were in her shoes? Or would you have walked away for your own peace earlier? Let us know where you're listening from and how you would have handled this kind of betrayal. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ground up, we'd love to hear your story too. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support helps keep these voices alive.